Hey guys, it's Luke from EDMProd. Today we're going to be looking at Ableton's Gate and how we can use it in some fun and creative ways. Gate is one of those tools that can be forgotten about at times. I guess it is designed for more of a mixing tool for dynamic control, but there is so much endless creative possibility to it, so we're going to be exploring that. As always, if you want some free stuff, check out the EDMProd website. The link is in the description for that. Okay, so first of all, I'll just go over the use of a gate, traditionally sort of more of a dynamic mixing tool. Then we'll just look at two classic creative effects and how those two techniques can be used to just generate like endless creative possibilities. So I've got a drum loop pulled up. This is without a gate. And then with the gate on. It just cleans it up a bit. What the gate is doing is emphasizing that louder, those peaks. It's not turning them up. It's not creating more volume like a compressor would be doing, but it's just turning the quiet parts down. So how this is happening, I'll just pull up the gate and let's do it again. First of all, if I just play this, you'll sort of see a really exaggerated response. So any audio that is above this threshold line is passing through the gate. It's going to be closed all the time unless audio passes through the threshold. So it's also worth noting that you see these grayed out lines here. That's the input, and the outlines, that's the output, and the grayed peaks in the background and the outline, they're two different values. So just making sure you understand that is kind of important to using this. The return describes the value in which it's like a secondary threshold for the output. So like when the volume goes down and passes the return, that's when the gain reduction starts happening again. But when it passes the threshold level, that's when the gate opens up. So this is the opening level, this is the closing level. And what the return does, it just makes it smoother of a sound. So instead of being really choppy like this, you turn the return up and we have a little bit more tail. It's a little bit smoother. So we can also use the attack, hold and release to make it even more smoother. So maybe turn the return back up, threshold a bit up. I'm going to turn this look ahead to 10 milliseconds, and that just helps define those transients. Makes it really snappy and really clear. And then where it gets into fine dynamic control is this floor knob. So this is how much gain reduction is happening. And so this is going to be all the way to negative infinity, but if I have it at 0, there's no gain reduction happening at all. So we can use this to dial to taste how much gain reduction. So now it's just like cleaning it up. It's not exaggerating, nothing too crazy and over the top. It's just cleaning up the drum loop. So you can hear all that reverb and that sort of background noise going on. But with the gate, now it's clean and it's dynamic. Next, let's look at how this trance gate was made. Cool, so now we're getting into the territory of sidechaining gates, and this is where it becomes much more creative. So what you'll need is some creative material to gate. In this case, I just have this like sort of synth swell with some reverb and filtering going on. And I'm going to pull up a gate. Oh, that's a glue compressor. I'm going to pull up a gate. And I'm going to put the gate before the reverb, actually, because I want the reverb to be reverbing the choppiness of the gate to make it sound a bit more smooth. If you pull up this triangle, we can engage the sidechain, and the sidechain is going to be triggering the opening and closing of this gate. So we'll need a sidechain trigger, right? So we have a new MIDI track here, and I'm just going to pull up a operator. And first of all, let's put some MIDI notes in. Shift Command M, put some MIDI notes in, and I just made them 16th notes, so they're quite quick. And if we listen to that, then it's going to sound like this. You can see the notes are actually quite long though. So I want it to be quite choppy and short. So I'm going to pull the sustain and the decay down. until we can hear that start to get choppy. Okay, great. That's what we want from the gate trigger. I'm just going to rename this track trigger, and then I'm going to turn it off. And whilst it's off, it will still trigger this gate. So if I go to this gate that I've put into this synth track here and go to the audio input and select trigger, now we can see that grayed input material. All we need to do now is to pull down the threshold so we can hear it. So the audio from this track, which is not being played, is triggering the gate to be opening and closing on this track. So I hope you can see how there's a lot of creative possibilities going on with sidechaining gates. So the next is gated reverb. Yes, everyone loves to hate gated reverb. Popularized in like discos and 80s and 90s sort of stuff. But let's have a look. This is sort of just like a dirty reverb. I put some amp on there, and I'll show you how to make this gated reverb kind of effect. Why I'm covering this quickly is just because now we can use the input from this track to actually trigger a send track. And it's the combination of these two techniques, triggering other tracks within your project and also triggering send tracks, which we can really create a lot of techniques and have a lot of fun with. So right now I just have a reverb on a send with 100% wet, and it's just stock standard settings. I'm going to send this snare into that reverb over here. And if we listen to it, now we can hear this reverb. The classic technique of gating a reverb would just be just to pull down the threshold. And then you can see that we're using the input, which is this reverb, to sort of like chop it off quickly. So that's the traditional way of gating a reverb. But if we use the sidechain, which we can do nowadays, and get the audio from the thing that we're actually triggering with, so the snare in this case, we can be much more specific with how much reverb we can have really short reverb values now. So that's just adding a little bit of thickness, which is really nice. If I compare that to without it. And some stereo. And then we could maybe color this as well. So just grabbing an amp, and I'm going to turn this all the way down because it's going to be really loud. So now it's just adding a little bit of gritty thickness, which is nice. Maybe turn this down so it's a bit more subtle. Okay, so that's all well and good, but how can we start creating some fun, interesting techniques? So I've got these chord stabs here, this loop, right? And I've also got a delay and a reverb send pulled up. This is a hybrid reverb, and this is two different delays with two different timings, creating this interesting sort of rhythmic, right? And if I go to this one, that's what the reverb sounds like. Cool, so let's pull up some new MIDI tracks. I'm creating two, and I'm going to make one trigger for the delay and one trigger for the reverb. So this one is going to be trig, delay, and trig, reverb. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to input some MIDI notes, and those MIDI notes are going to trigger these effects at particular times. So first of all, let's just pull up an operator like last time onto this. A sine wave is the best option. And now we can start triggering these effects. If I make a MIDI track and I want this delay, let's say this delay to be triggering each time one of these triggers. So where's that? That's here. It doesn't matter which note. I'm just going to keep it on C3. And then another one here, right? So the next step is pulling a gate onto this send. And now I'm going to sidechain this gate to trig delay. So what's happening now is the audio from here, I'm sending it into this return track, and it's coming in here, but there's no audio passing through this gate. It's remaining closed. So you can't hear any delay or processing afterwards. So what will allow this gate to open is when these notes play. If I was to move these notes over, then the gate would open here and here. So as I turn the threshold down, you'll see that you can start hearing the delays occur. So why is this useful? Well, now I can go into this MIDI track and actually change the chance and the probability of these being triggered. So let's turn these down to about 50%. And now just randomly, the delays start to be triggered 50% of the time. Isn't that such an easy way to create variation? Now I'm going to do the same thing with the reverb, but instead of creating a new MIDI track, I can just copy this, holding Option and dragging, and then I'm going to consolidate this with Command J, loop it, and extend the loop. Now, so every second MIDI note has a 50% chance of triggering, but it's not going to be triggering anything yet. If I go to my reverb send and put a gate on it, put it in front of the hybrid reverb, and sidechain this to the trig reverb track here. Now this is triggering this gate, but we haven't sent any audio to it yet. So let's send these chords into this reverb. Go back to the reverb and we can adjust the threshold. So now 50% of the time, this reverb is going to be triggered on the second note. So remember to turn off these tracks, and then I'm just going to add some drums to it and let's see how it sounds. So we can see how we've created some evolving effects pretty easily and pretty quickly. Okay, so what I have here is an electro drum rhythm, just a kick, a snare, and a hi-hat, and it sounds like this. So this is a classic sort of foundation of an electro beat, and let's start using the gate to create some interesting variations. First of all, I'm going to create a new track. I'm going to make it gray and label it Ghost 1. And I'm going to use this track as a ghost track to start triggering some interesting stuff. We just discussed in how we can turn effects on and off. What if we were to take this another step further? We can use gates to trigger any tracks, return tracks or MIDI tracks or audio tracks, remember? So why don't we use a gate to trigger some generative transitions which change each time. So I just highlighted the fourth beat of the fourth bar here. And if I make a MIDI note on this beat here. So let's set up this note to trigger a drum transition. So if we think to a drummer, how do they create transitions? They usually do extra notes on the snares, or maybe they'll do a drum roll on the toms. Putting in some extra snares is a classic way of doing a drum fill. So let's set up a return track that has a beat repeat on it and use this gate to trigger that randomly. So if I go over my send track, which is empty at the moment, and pull up a beat repeat, I'm going to send the snare into this return track so we can hear what's going on. And I'll quickly show you how I'll set up this beat repeat too. Moving from left to right, I'm going to turn the interval onto 1/4. Make sure this repeat is unhighlighted. The chance is at 100%. The offset can be at 0. The gate, I want 4. So I want it to be 4/16. And the grid, I want no triplets. I want this trigger to be on 1/16, and then let's turn up the variation a bit. The volume could probably come up a little bit, so maybe turn the filter on as well. Not only is this going to be triggering this randomly, but it's also going to be different each time because of how we've set up the beat repeat as well. So okay, I'm going to pull up a gate and sidechain this gate to the ghost track. Okay, so the ghost track isn't showing up, and that's because I actually don't have an instrument on here. So you got to remember to put operator on there. And then, or any sine wave really, and then it will come up and you can sidechain that. Oh, I got to turn this off as well. And once this plays, it will trigger the gate to open and the beat repeat to repeat this snare sort of randomly each time. So we can see how that's changing, but we also want to turn down the chance of this. So now it happens 50% of the time, and every time it does happen, it's a little bit different. Cool, so we're using this ghost track to trigger a sort of snare fill on this one. Let's use this ghost track to trigger some more stuff. I'm going to create a new MIDI track, and in fact, I'm going to duplicate this kick track, and then I'm going to call this kick fill and make it white. Next, I'm going to put some notes in a sort of a fill location, a spot that you'd want a kick drum to be in a fill. So maybe a little bit earlier than this. There we go. That's a nice spot. Maybe even let's add another note here. So now we have two notes, and this is the same kick drum as we have here. But what we're going to do on this track is use a gate to trigger this from this one as well. So it'll be like whenever this snare is triggered to do its little roll, then this will be triggered as well. So if I go to my gate and I sidechain this to Ghost 1, now whenever the snare drum is triggered, so is this as well. But this is a little bit too much. I'm going to highlight these and turn the chance down on these as well. So these, sometimes it's going to trigger this one, sometimes both, sometimes neither. It's important to create variation within, or the randomness within the fill as well, because then it'll make each fill slightly different. Lastly, for the hi-hat, I want some variation as well. And this time I'm going to actually create a gate to be triggered within the track. And I'm going to be doing this in Ableton by creating an instrument rack, hitting Command G. And if I show the chain list, I can then duplicate this chain. And I'm going to call this one wet and this one dry. And what we're going to do is we're going to have two gates this time, and both being triggered by this. But this time I'm going to have the dry being triggered to turn off and the wet being triggered to turn on. And the wet one have some effects on it, which create this, this affected hat just in this section here for the transition. So if I get my gate, I'm going to copy that and paste it over here as well. So now we have two. So for this dry channel, I want it to be on all the time. And then when this note triggers, I want it to turn off. And that's what I want to achieve in this dry channel. So right now there's no audio coming through. What I'm actually going to do is flip this gate. So now it's on. We can see the threshold, the input signal came through, but the threshold wasn't there. So I've lowered the threshold to a level where this trigger can actually trigger this. So because it's flipped, any audio that's coming through will just come through. But when this is triggered, it will stop it. It will stop it from coming through, and it will close it off. That's exactly what we want. That's great. So now I'm going to do the exact same thing, but have the gate flipped the other way around this time. So I'm going to sidechain it from Ghost 1 again, and you can see that there's no audio coming through until it gets triggered, and I have to reduce the threshold, and then now we hear the audio coming through. That's exactly what we want. So now if I have them both playing, you'll hear it'll just be going the whole time. Because once it's triggered, this one turns off and this one turns on, and then it switches back. So now we can put effects on this wet chain and see what that does. I'm going to pull up some Redux. You can see how the audio is swapping back and forth between these two. And we can use this wet chain to really do whatever we like with this. I'm going to grab an LFO and modulate the rate on the Redux here. So map that to the rate. So you can see how that's, maybe turn the dry wet down a bit as well. It's also fun to experiment with how sending this into other sends that we've already set up, creative sends, can sound as well. So isn't that cool? So the beat repeat is actually catching onto the hat and repeating it through here as well, which is really nice. So now it's creating sort of different effects each time. So we've got one here, and maybe let's make another one here and make it a bit bigger. I'm going to Command J, consolidate that, and then put this into one MIDI clip, one MIDI note, sorry. Maybe make it even bigger again. See how this sounds. So let's just fine tune this transition a bit. I'm running into a problem where I like this snare to be beat repeated, but I don't want this one to be repeated by this effect here. So what I'm going to do is actually just duplicate this track and turn the send off on this one. Let's call this send off snare. And then I'm going to take all of the other snares away and then delete this snare. And so this one is just a regular snare that's just going to trigger each time, and it's going to have no effects on it, even when this other stuff triggers. So now we're sort of creating these transitions as we like with creative effects on the gate. So far, I've just been using what we already have here with the kicks and the snares, but of course, you can also use whatever you like. I can pull in a crash if I wanted. Let's say, okay, so that's a nice one. And let's put this note here. I'm going to make it one shot. I'm going to label it crash fill. If I get my gate from this Ghost 1 and put it here, now we have a crash that's triggered with this fill as well. If I make sure to turn this chance down, I'm going to make this one a bit more, 65, and this one's 50. So now we're starting to generate some interesting transitions via using these. And they're going to be slightly different each time as well. I hope you can see how this can be a really powerful technique to create some interesting variation in your loops. Okay, so now I've complexified this a bit more and added some bass and stabs as well. And what I've done is I've supplemented these transitions with some some notes that have a reduced chance on them. So a few kicks here and there that are triggered sometimes, like this one. In this probability group, these are the things that are these white tracks are the things that are being triggered by the gate. I've got an open hat here. And then I've got a whole bunch of these, which aren't being triggered by gates, but they are have a reduced chance as well. So they are triggered sometimes and other times they're not. So let's have a listen and I'll see how it sounds. I actually have another ghost track here, which is triggering this thing. And the only reason this is being triggered by a ghost track here is because I actually want all of these 4 notes to be triggered at once. So this is being triggered here. And then there's an automation on this send, which like sends this last note into some echo, which is an interesting effect. And so there's a lot of stuff going on and it gets more and more complex, but it's really fun to use these gates to create these variations. Okay, so these drums are sounding nice. I'll show you some of the bass that I've added and a little gate technique I used in there as well. So we've been using gate to trigger variations in the drums so far, which makes sense, but we can also use it for melodic elements as well. Just as a quick little rounding off idea, I just put in a few notes here and had that triggered by the same gate that is triggering from this one. So whenever this big transition occurs, then there's a few notes here that are played. We can really do this with anything. It's quite limitless. And we can use gates to trigger any tracks on and off. So use your creativity and go wild with it. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you've learned some techniques on how we can use gates creatively, how we can use ghost tracks to trigger them, to trigger themselves, to trigger other tracks, to trigger return tracks. There's so many possibilities here and I have so much fun just experimenting around with this. So I hope it helps you stay creative as well. If you have any other techniques on how you've been creative with gates, leave it in the comments below. I'll have a look. I'd love to see some other suggestions as well if I've missed any. And yeah, feel free to like, share, subscribe, do all that stuff as well. So until next time, I'll see you then.